The book of Esther, one of those really interesting books of the Bible where God is not mentioned at all. We're never told how God feels or what God's doing. We don't even know if God's working behind the scenes in this story. The author never tells us. And like an allegory, the story of Esther doesn't really tell you the lesson that you're supposed to learn. The author, probably on purpose, at least I would guess, allows the readers to figure out on their own what the moral of this story is. And really, it's a story that doesn't seem to be geared towards children. Just a heads up, parents, as we'll kind of see tonight, hopefully without going into too much detail. And throughout the rest of this story, you see these moments of intense graphic violence. It's a kind of bizarre but really cool story. And for those of you who have nothing better to do with your time, I'll be continuing to post videos of me reading each chapter of this book as we continue this series. So look for them to be posted twice a week. Now, as we talked about last week, the king's decree goes out to all of the provinces of this kingdom, searching for the most beautiful women that there are, right? Someone who could replace Queen Vashti after her complete and total banishment for refusing the king's demand while he was drunk at this insane party. So all of these letters went out with this royal decree, and all of the families of the nation had to send their daughters back to the royal palace of Susa to become concubines for the king. All of their daughters. Can you even imagine what that would have been like as a parent? Men that you have never seen before ride into your village, and they announce that the king, another guy that you have never even seen before, demands that you give him your daughter so that she can be interviewed by the king. And really, you don't have a choice. To refuse a royal decree would mean your death. It would mean enslavement for your family, and your daughter would still be taken away. Any dreams that you've had for her, any plans that she had for her own life, any chance of a future with holidays filled with grandchildren playing around in your living room, all of that was gone. You would likely never see her again. It's hard for us to even imagine that, but it was the law of the land, and unfortunately, it wasn't really uncommon. And while we'd like to think that this kind of thing is ancient history, there are, in fact, still areas of the world where this is kind of seen as normal. And there's still others, even here in the Willamette Valley, where this still happens in the shadows. This is why the work of nonprofits like Pole Gyms and Safety Compass, their work is so deeply critical. People like our very own Chrissy Mondene, who constantly work to protect, to rescue, to heal victims of human trafficking, because nobody should ever be thought of or treated as an object for somebody else to use. And as followers of Jesus, this is one of the easiest things that we should all be able to get behind, and something that we should all support. That's why Crystal and I financially support Pole Gyms every single month with a recurring donation. It's why we donated to Safety Compass's yearly fundraiser that's going on right now. This kind of stuff is critical. It is life-changing work that they're doing in our community. And if you would like to donate as well, you can find more information on both of these nonprofits at their websites that are listed right below. I highly encourage you to check them out. Now, back to the story. At this point, the author introduces us to Mordecai, a Jewish man who at a very young age was brought to the capital city of Babylon with his family when the Babylonians came in and just conquered Jerusalem. And he had lived in the capital city of Babylon until the Persians then came in and conquered them. And then at some point they moved to the new Persian capital of Susa, where for unknown reasons, his aunt and uncle end up dying. And he lovingly adopts their daughter, his cousin Hadassah, into his family and his house. And he treats her, the scriptures tell us, like his own daughter. Hadassah is one of these unfortunate girls who's chosen as a prospect for the king. So she's rounded up with so many of these other girls and brought to the king's harem. But Mordecai, before she leaves, warns her to keep her nationality hidden. And so she uses another name, Esther, as she's taken from her family and locked inside the royal harem with hundreds of other girls as they wait for the king to return from war. And there really were so many girls. And we're talking young girls here because they weren't yet married. And in this time in human history, most of the girls tended to be married off quite young, at least by our standards today. I'm talking 14, 15, maybe as old as 16. And there were so many of them who were to be interviewed for the position that the royal eunuchs who were in charge of the harem had to have this system in place to keep track of who had already been interviewed by the king and who hadn't. The harem and then the second harem is apparently what it was called. The author tells us that the pre-interview process was a long affair, and it took about 12 months to complete before these girls would be considered ready for their meeting with the king. It involved first 6 months of using oil of myrrh, which apparently was used as an antiseptic to treat and heal any wounds that there were, to dull any pain that there might be, and it was also mixed together with a couple of other things as a mouthwash to kill bacteria for fresher smelling breath. And then these next 6 months were made up of constant baths of perfume and ointments. They'd be applied constantly so they'd be absorbed into their skin, and they probably were even mixed into their food and drink so that they would just kind of basically smell better. Once this year of preparation was finished, each of the girls would have a single night to make a lasting impression on the king. And then she'd never see him again unless he specifically called for her by her name, which would have meant that he especially enjoyed her company. But most of the girls would never again be requested, and then they would live out the rest of their lives in this harem full of all of these other girls. So we're told that Esther is prepared for the king while he's off at war, basically getting his butt kicked by the Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae, which really is this incredible battle that will be studied and idolized for pretty much the rest of human history. And eventually, Xerxes has to turn back from his massive war, and he abandons all of his dreams of conquering Greece, and he returns to the capital city a defeated man. And while this is all happening on the other side of the world, Esther is back at the royal harem, waiting for the king to return with the rest of all of these girls that had been taken from their homes and their families. Now, here's where I want to pause the story for just a moment, right? The author of Esther doesn't give us any details of what she's feeling or what she's thinking or what her everyday life is like, right? We don't get any insight into the life that was living in this harem. But at least me, it's pretty hard to read this and not wonder. To wonder what was running through her head and how she must have missed her family, the fear and the anxiety of what was going to be happening to her when she met the king, and all of the roller coaster of emotions that must have been running through her at all times. The thing that I find so remarkable about this young girl is that somehow she's able to leave this glowing impression on the people who meet her. I mean, obviously we know that she's beautiful, right? That's one of the reasons she's chosen. So that had to have, at least helped with the first impression. But we know that physical beauty, all of us know this, the physical beauty can lose all of its magnetic qualities very fast when it's paired with someone who is bitter and angry and vengeful. Make no mistake about it, Esther had every reason to be one of those people. Beautiful on the outside and yet so broken and vile and rotten on the inside. She was a Jew who was living in a foreign land that was hostile enough to her and her people that this entire story, this entire book revolves around her hiding her identity and her heritage so that she's spared the fate of so many of the people that had come before her. You then add on to that the loss of both of her parents when she was really, really young, which would have obviously had this incredible impact on anybody walking through that. But for a young girl in that time period, it would have meant that her future was at risk. Without a father to put up a dowry, her options for a husband and a family and a future of her own were in serious jeopardy. And then out of nowhere, and due to no choice of her own, she's taken from her home. She's taken from this family that had become her own after such huge loss. And then she's told that she's now an object to be used and then discarded if she's found not to be good enough. And for years, she waits for the very single moment that would determine the rest of her life. She has no idea what the future holds for her. All she knows is that she isn't the one holding her future. Everything in her life seems to have been out of her control. Where she was born, who she was, the fate of her family, even her own future is so far out of her control that it would be completely understandable for us to read this story and see her fall into despair and hopelessness. That is what we should be expecting while we read the book of Esther. But that's not her. Those aren't the choices that she makes. And I say choices because you know that she had to choose who she was going to be every single morning. Every bath, every time she thought of Mordecai and her family, every night as she laid down to go to sleep, wondering what in the world tomorrow would bring. She had to choose. Faith that God was doing something that she didn't see or understand. Faith that the stories that she had learned when she was a little girl of how trustworthy God had been to her people, that they weren't just fairy tales. She had to choose who she was. And there had to have been this massive black hole of despair that was constantly pulling her, trying to drag her down into this darkness to consume her. And yet she persisted. She became the woman that Haggai, the man in charge of this harem, absolutely adores. And we don't get an inside look into their relationship or what it was about Esther that he loved. But from what the author of this book tells us, I assume they had a pretty special relationship. Here's what it says in Esther chapter 2, verse 9. The young woman pleased him and gained his favor so that he accelerated the process of the beauty treatments and the special diet that she received. He assigned 7 hand-picked female servants to her from the palace and transferred her and her servants to the harem's best quarters. And in verse 15, the moment that Esther had been waiting and preparing 4 years for finally arrived. 4 years of preparation. Esther was the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had adopted her as his own daughter. And when her turn came to go to the king, she did not ask for anything except for what Haggai, the king's eunuch, keeper of the women, suggested. Esther gained favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. She was taken to the king in the palace in the 10th month, the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all of the other women. She won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other girls. He placed the royal crown upon her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. We're told that Esther makes such an impression on the king during her interview process that he crowns her his queen and throws this massive banquet in her honor, and he declares a public holiday to announce her crowning as queen. Can you even imagine what this would have been like? Everything that had led up to this moment, the nerves, the emotions, the fear, the trepidation of what this young girl was going through, and then the proclamation that changes everything. All of her fears and all of her worries that she had carried for years vanished in an instant. And they were probably replaced by a whole set of brand new fears, along with so many questions and joy and confusion and relief and terror. She was the queen of the Persian Empire. She had more power and wealth than any other woman on the planet. But she knew that it wasn't her power, nor was it her wealth. She learned that from Vashti. It could all be taken away in an instant. And just because she was queen didn't mean that her future was finally hers. It just meant that it belonged to somebody else. Things were different. They were better, to be sure, but there still was this small voice that kept telling her that she needed to be careful. She needed to keep her true identity a secret. She wasn't safe. Verse 20 says this: Esther had not revealed her family background or her ethnicity, as Mordecai had directed her. She obeyed Mordecai's orders as she always had while he raised her. She wasn't able to relax. Even when she was queen, she couldn't be herself. She couldn't worship God openly, if she could worship God at all. And then one day, Mordecai, her cousin, overhears a plot to assassinate the king. Two of Xerxes' advisors, Bigthana and Teresh, who you know are trouble just by reading their names, right? In my head, when I read their names, I kind of picture Crab and Goyle. Well, Scripture tells us that they were eunuchs and that they were putting together this plan to assassinate Xerxes. I'm guessing it probably had something to do with the fact that the king had made them eunuchs, but I really don't know that because the Scripture doesn't tell us for sure, but that's just my hunch. Well, the job of these two goons is to guard the door to the king's private quarters, which would really put them in a perfect position to kill him before anybody who could get there to help. But when Mordecai overhears them making these plans of assassination, he goes straight to his cousin Esther. And then she goes straight to the king and tells him what Mordecai had heard. There's this huge investigation, all kinds of questions are asked, probably in some not so polite and enjoyable fashions. And when it's found out that it was true, the king orders Bigthana and Teresh impaled on sharpened poles. And that's the end of chapter 2. Nice, right? There is a ton that happens in this short little chapter, but here's what I want to leave you with right now. Esther had become the woman that God had designed her to be. She had no idea what God was doing behind the scenes. She had every right to be angry and bitter for the lot in life that she had been handed. She'd gone through tremendous pain and loss in her life, but it did not define her. From what we know of her time in the harem, we know that she chose to become the woman that God designed her to be. And for what we know about life, just life in general, and psychology, basic psychology, we know that that does not happen by accident. It's not the default reaction that people have to tragedy and hardship. But when we choose to allow God to use the hard moments of our lives to shape us, we can become better, more mature, more resilient people, ready for the bigger moments that lay in front of us that we don't even see yet. So as you walk into this next week, whatever that may look like during these unprecedented days that we're living through right now, I want you to remember these moments. These moments don't define you. You define them. And they can either be the stone that crushes you against the hard place, or they can be the chisel that shapes you into the person that God needs you to be for the future that you are walking into. And at the end of the day, you get to choose what role you're going to play in that future and what kind of a person that you're going to become.